Hello, everybody. Greetings. We are going to have our exciting White Council here with Reverend Loretta Jaunzarins of one of the churches in Canada, that she will give us a little bit of an indication of what they are doing that is kind of new to Christianity, in the sense that it's very different from what people may assume about Christianity, and she has a very unique style. I actually met her through a friend that you have seen his video about global warming and about the environment. His name is Uranian, that's his Elven name. And he told me that he went to a church in which this Reverend saw some of my videos, or at least he shared videos to her, and he said that I would connect really well with her because of the way that she is teaching things, and she has a very creative and unique way of giving her sermons that I believe is a very powerful way of uniting people together and bringing forth a lot of understanding to one another, which is really the goal. And I really am very excited to have her on, because I have a lot of questions for her and for people to ask questions to her, which I'll put the chat box right now. So please go ahead and ask some questions so I can see, and I can give the questions to Loretta. So Loretta, go ahead and just introduce yourself.
Thank you. It's great to be here after a few attempts with technical difficulties. We finally, just like magic, it happened. So it's great to be here. So my name is Loretta Jaunzarins, and I'm a Lutheran pastor in the ELCIC, which is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. And we're the more progressive side of Lutheranism and Christianity. We tend to be. And but I would say about myself that I first identify as one with all of creation, in a quest to connect with the divine. And I am a Christian, and then I am a Lutheran. But before that, it's this connection with all of God's creation and with the divine.
That's wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and just get started on these questions, because I really thought about some of the questions that I was hoping that would bring to light a lot of what you do at the church. So you answered already what your faith or spiritual path that you represent. So Lutheran Christianity. And for those of the viewers who don't really understand what the difference is between a Lutheran or just a Catholic or a regular Christian, can you explain a little bit about that path?
Okay, so right now they estimate there's about 30,000 different Christian denominations in the world. There's a lot of Lutherans. We came out of the 16th century Reformation, Martin Luther and the other reformers, so that our theology is a little bit different than Catholicism because of that, or at least up until this point. We believe that in God's grace for all people who want that relationship with God. And of course, for Christians, that comes through Jesus.
Now, I just want to get a little bit deeper, because I know a lot about Martin Luther. So it's not King. It's not the King Jr. So can you explain to the audience, just for those who are younger, or they just maybe never really heard about this person, can you tell a little bit of what made him significant in history?
A lot of things made him significant in history. We are what we are today because of what Luther did. So the Western world, Europe at that time, was strictly Roman Catholic. Throughout church history, people have tried to reform the church. Sometimes that worked, other times it was met with much resistance. So Luther, following the tradition of reformers that went before him, tried to not start a new church, but clean up abuses that were going on in the 16th century at that time. So the church, for example, the only salvation is through the Roman Catholic Church, which Luther said, no, all people can come to God. It doesn't have to be strictly through one particular denomination. So he influenced changes in society, more or less was able to launch the Enlightenment, all different kinds of the Renaissance, all different kinds of things because of he went out there on a limb for the rest of us, basically.
Yeah, just to show how much of a kind of a rebel of his time he really was. He went around and nailed on the church doors an actual piece of paper that said, it was basically saying that the priests inside of these churches were wrong for accepting money to cleanse people of their sins. Like, he was basically saying that is something that needed to stop in the churches. And I think that when we think about spirituality today from an evolved, higher consciousness, you can understand that money and spirituality really shouldn't mix. And Martin Luther was one of those that was very much against priests, taking advantage over the masses. And I thought that he was a really great figure for, just for doing that.
And the money issue was it was a fundraising campaign. So people got threatened. If you want to go to heaven when you die, if you want to release your loved ones from purgatory, then you have to pay for it. And of course, that money was used to build St. Peter's in Rome. So it was a fundraising campaign.
And you know what? That's so strange, because if you think about the Egyptians and their Book of Dead, they very much did kind of the same thing, where in order to surpass the gates of basically like the gateways before you get to heaven, you would have to pay and have a lot of money to fight certain types of demons and monsters that you would actually, you would meet before going into the golden fields of wheat, which symbolized heaven. So, I mean, that always kind of was around the idea of religion, where a lot of people in high places in these religions would take advantage of the masses and the people, and really try to, to basically to take their money and, to say that it was going to offer them some type of, spiritual ascension. And so I just remember learning about Martin Luther, and he always stuck with me as one of those that really took a stand to, just make the world a little bit more fair, a little bit more righteous, and I guess truthful is really the word I want to look for.
And the other thing he did was he put the Bible in the hands of the ordinary person. So prior to that, the scriptures were in Latin, and only priests and church hierarchy had access to them. So Luther translated the Bible from Latin into German, because of course he was based in Germany, and gave those scriptures to people to read for themselves. And then all of a sudden people said, well, we've been taught this, but that's not what it says in the Bible. Mm-hmm. So there was no more instrument to use to control people. And as people became more literate with the invention of the printing press, and Luther started, the more or less all children going to school, kindergarten and all those kind of things. People became literate. They can read the scripture for themselves. And they realized that the church no longer had a hold over them like the church wanted to have. So there people were set free in all different ways because of Luther, and basically translating the Bible into German, and then of course in the Mass was said in German. Everything was done in the language of the people.
Well, as somebody who can read energy in people, and even though he is not alive, I can read the energy of the events and the things that he did within this world. And I will say that he was moving from a higher state of consciousness. He really.
Yeah, he definitely was.
Let's go on to the second question, because we're going to get more deeper into this. So you
can I say a couple more things?
Oh, sure. Why not?
About myself. I'm really love Celtic spirituality.
Wonderful.
And yeah, and that whole notion of things being united and not this polarization dichotomies that we tend to create. I also, like I had mentioned earlier before we got live, the different mystics in Christianity, like Meister Eckhart, and a contemporary one, Richard Rohr, who teaches, who's a Franciscan priest, monk, who teaches that God is, the divine is in everything, not just human beings, but in every cell that we have and in all creatures. And also the Aramaic Jesus, the language of Jesus, Aramaic, maybe we can talk about that at some point. Mm-hmm. And Matthew Fox and creation spirituality. Those are all things that have influenced me, especially in the last 5 years or 10 years.
And I would say that you probably are somebody, I mean, if you can accept the Celtic religions, and I mean, you found my channel because it's all about nature. And even though I don't subscribe to a particular religion, I am more of a mystic, and I'm a kind of a universalist where I can see truth in all things. But I'm very much close to like Wicca. And so I have this understanding about, the great spirit within us all in nature. So that's something that you could probably understand, and it can accept in others, which is really great, because I think a lot of Christians, they have a hard time accepting paganism and Wicca, because in the past it was really frowned upon. But being someone who can keep an open mind and really understand the idea about the Holy Spirit within everything, within animals and nature and just everything that's within our universe, that is something that I think is what a lot of people need to hear. And if I can say, I mean, I've just found out that your daughter is a pagan. And so I think that's wonderful that you're able to have that type of acceptance. And so my followers and subscribers who are watching and who are pagans, I just hope that they learned something today, that there are Christians out there who can accept them.
And I find more of an affinity and a natural draw toward people who have a love for nature and see divine energy in all of nature, as opposed to people, and here I am splitting people, but as opposed to a lot of folks, and it really doesn't matter what religion, who don't have that connection with nature and don't see the importance of the earth and all of the cosmos. So to me, I'm attracted more to people because of that, regardless of how they express their spirituality, than I am to a standard traditional Lutheran who, believes a certain doctrine but doesn't have that spirituality and that connection.
Well, you would fit very well with the Elven community then. Okay, so number 2, if I can go on here, I wanted to ask you this because Uranian told me that he enjoys your sermons so much because you are very open-minded with a lot of different things and ideas. And this is really why I asked you to the White Council to give Christianity a chance to show itself in a new light, one that the media may not show at this time, or those who have an agenda to dismantle it completely on their own terms may not show. And he said that you call yourself creative. Can you explain how a reverend can be creative?
For me, I like to be creative through things like design and music. I'm a gardener. So here at the church, when I arrived here 13 years ago, you could basically say there was nothing here outside. And I felt right away not a good vibe. And I had to have plants, and not just plants, but it had to be designed because, for good flow and feng shui principles and all that, good spirituality, healing, all that kind of thing. So I've spent 13 years developing the gardens here, and a healing meditation garden, and wellness gardening programs and those kind of things. So I take it a bit outside of the box of the typical, maybe stereotypical idea of what a pastor is, because I believe in healing and wellness, and where do we best find those things? And I believe that's through nature and fractals and all that. So I kind of take my those things out into the garden and out into nature. So I try to do that creatively. And in the worship services, I'm somewhat limited by funds. There's I don't have an endless pot of money for a lot of things, but I try to be creative with music, especially prayers and the liturgy, so that I create a different service every week, and we don't just do something strictly out of a hymn book, because a lot of people find that a dead piece of paper. Shouldn't be, but a lot of people find it that way. I do. If I couldn't create a worship service every week, then I would feel very stifled. And I try to, with my preaching, not just stick to the lectionary. So we have a set scriptures every week that's handed down to us to say this is what you should be doing. But getting back to Luther allowed pastors to be creative. And as soon as I found that out in seminary, I said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take Luther up on that. And that's what I've done for 18 years now.
I love that.
So he gave me that freedom 500 years ago to go ahead and do that. And that's what I've hung my hat on.
That's wonderful. Especially because I think what it does is it allows a lot of different interests to come to the church. So, you'll get people that are very interested in meditation, or they're interested in yoga, they're interested in gardening. So you really have a diverse community, which is really great, because sometimes when people go to churches, the church kind of population is in its decline because they offer the same thing over and over, which is good for some people who really like that kind of that familiarity, and they like to have that same type of style of church worship. But offering all these different things really allows a nice, diverse community to come and just to be together as a community. And I think that is really wonderful. Okay, number 3. Do you have anything to say before I move on?
Well, one thing I say to people is to also not leave their brains at the door.
Okay.
To Luther challenged. I've spent my whole life challenging. You know, my parents did not appreciate that when I was younger. Um, but I give people that freedom to challenge as well. So don't take what I say to be the gospel truth or what the church teaches to be the gospel truth, because we know that we're supposed to evolve in our thinking. We're each supposed to have an experience with the divine. So I don't give people something on a spoon and say, here's your spirituality, here's what it is. I expect people to come in and ask questions and challenge me, challenge the system, and hopefully to grow spiritually that way. And for some people, that's good. Other people, like you mentioned, they don't want that. They want to get their nice little package, and then they don't have to worry about, are they going down a wrong path or those kind of things. But I encourage people to think.
You know what that reminds me of is something that I've recently been thinking, is that we're all at different levels of creativity and creation within ourselves. So while you're at a very high level of creativity, where you can go in and create things new that have kind of never been done before or are very rare, and you can actually be at this high level of creativity, and there are other people that are just not at that same level of creativity, and so there are different levels of creation. It's really interesting to see, and I believe that it happens when you get a calling, you get a type of spiritual awakening within you that calls to you, that wants to express your creative self. And surely you have that, and you see that. And so I think that's really great, because what you're doing is you're turning on the creativity in others. You're inspiring others to be creative too. So I think that is wonderful.
Yeah, I hope I'm doing that.
I can tell.
I journey with people, and then I ask them to journey with me too. So we walk together through whatever it is. So we each do our own exploring in creativity and spirituality.
You know, that is what spirituality actually is. It's creation. It's creativity.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you've seen my video on the Palladian spirituality, but I have like this 40-minute video where I read some of the Palladian messages that were given to Billy Meyer in the 70s. And the whole idea is that an enlightened human being is one that knows that it's one with creation itself. So what we would call God, and what kind of is the universal word, is actually more seen as creation itself. And so when you're in flow and in alignment to creation itself, you become a creator. You create new things within your life. You create your image, you create, your home, you create books, and you're doing something new. You're not just on earth to follow others, but you're actually on earth to kind of pave your own path and pave your own way. And that's something that I have been embracing, which is why I take on kind of a unique style. But this is me. I'm creating myself. I'm creating something new, or at least I'm trying to. And I feel like we are aligned on that same level. So it's really nice to see.
That's what we're supposed to be doing.
I agree. I think so. I think we're supposed to, well, that one verse about how God made us in his image. In some kind of way, we are to mirror this idea of being a creator. We are then supposed to be a co-creator. And Tolkien actually said that we are sub-creators. That's what he said a lot, is that we are sub-creators. He called himself a sub-creator because he's on Earth and he's creating his own world of Middle Earth. And so he believes that, it comes funneling down what we would call like the source or the collective is coming through him, and then he's being like a mini creator. So we have the large creator that creates the universe. It's that force that creates everything, and then you become a sub-creator or a co-creator. And we are reflections of the larger creator.
Well, there's a few places in the scriptures that talk about that, but what you were referring to is in the first creation story in Genesis, where God, or Elohim, says, let us, the plural, make humankind in our image. So God created male and female, and then sent them off to create, to become creators. So that seeing the female and the male is very important as well. Especially in patriarchal societies or whatever. But the creation is both the male and the female, which is the image of God. So it's not unlike the second creation story, which is more, God created Adam. I like the first one. And then I like the one from Proverbs. Scholars say there's about 20 different creation stories, which is really cool in the scriptures.
Oh, wow. Where are the 20 different ones?
Well, there's 2 in Genesis, of course. The Gospel of John, the first chapter, is they call a cosmic creation story. In the beginning was the Word. And then there's the one from Proverbs where it's wisdom who's a co-creator with God. And of course, Jesus is thought to have been the incarnation of wisdom. So it's
interesting way to look at it. Yeah. And
all
then
kinds of different.
The Hebrew word for wisdom, well, at least they call wisdom Sophia. And so that is another type of personification of wisdom. That's interesting.
Yes, and wisdom becomes personified. Yes.
I like that. Which is, you have the masculine wisdom as Jesus, and then you have Sophia as the feminine wisdom, because both energies, divine and masculine, have to have wisdom within them. I mean, it's kind of it's always a product of our experiences. And at least if you take those experiences within you and you take them to heart as if they are, meaningful to you, that's when you gain and acquire wisdom. And so that's really a wonderful way to look at Jesus as kind of the personification of wisdom. That's really great.
And so Jesus was considered to be a wisdom master.
Yeah,
especially to get into
master teacher. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That's really great. Okay, number 3. We have a lot of questions here, but we'll have more time at the end to kind of chat. This is fun. In what ways have you seen a change come over religion and church? I've heard a combining of churches needed to happen because of attendance has been very low. What do you attribute this to? And I don't want this to just be, kind of a negative, sad thing for Christians, but I kind of want them to see what is going on. Are we in a time of transformation? Are people questioning a lot? What is happening, in your opinion?
Well, I definitely think it's a time of transformation that has been going on for a few centuries now. And especially with the Enlightenment, the freedom for scientists, the freedom of thought, the First World War really destroyed a lot of people's love for the church. Things that the church has done. This is treaties, for example, this is Treaties Recognition Week here in Canada anyway. And tomorrow night I'm going to a lecture on the doctrine of discovery, which is still on the books in the Roman Catholic Church and still very much negatively impacts Indigenous people around the world. So there's secularism. People don't need to believe. I guess in our postmodern world, Um, if you stop believing in heaven or hell, then you don't need the church anymore, especially if all the church was for you was your ticket into heaven, so to speak. So the church has, we should have been doing things decades ago and responding, but you entrench, you circle around the wagons and hope that you can keep everything exactly the way it's been. But people have the freedom now to reject these institutions, which is why I think we see so much turmoil now, because they just aren't what they say they are anymore. And of course, in our consumeristic society, people are attracted to a lot of other things that give them more meaning than what the church has traditionally done. Some churches are thriving or holding their own because people do like the tradition. Some churches are doing well because they're conservative, and I'm not. But conservatism is quite popular right now, as we've seen in our politics around the world. So there's a lot of factors that are causing the church to decline.
Can we go back to the Enlightenment? I think that this would be a very interesting conversation. It seems like you have a lot of knowledge about this. As you know, on my channel, if you have not seen, I am very vocal about the Illuminati. One of my perspectives is that I understand where the Illuminati comes from as far as those that came together in order to fight the power of the churches. They were very wealthy atheists, or at least people that were unhappy about organized religion. And they came together. Adam Weishaupt brought them together in Bavaria, and they set together doctrines that if you can go in and you can actually read the doctrines, you can see a systematic approach of getting rid of religion. I mean, they have a very step-by-step process of how they would eventually take away the power from the churches and get rid of religion. What is it, in your opinion? I mean, I'm just asking to go from your own intuition. Why? Because I can see the perspective of where the Illuminati is coming from as far as, yes, organized religion has caused a lot of issues. And I'm sure back then they were really fed up with the hold of churches. But why can't the Illuminati members see people like you and those who are more of a mystical nature that are not tyrants in a religious sense? What do you think it is, and why do we have this spiritual battle where it's so divided between those who are a part of the Illuminati and the atheist organizations in America versus those that are very spiritual and open-minded? And I would bet you that the mystics, the spiritualists, and the ones that would, be very much like you can actually be open-minded about them. What is it about the Illuminati and the ones that were part of the Enlightenment, and at least, it was kind of taught to their bloodlines, and that's why we still have it today? What is it about them that they're not able to actually see a more softer side of religion?
Well, that's a complex, that's a big question. I think people who are more mystic tend to lie low. We tend to be closer to the ground. I'm interested in politics, but I'm not interested in the games in politics or the power that people can achieve and the wealth through politics, no matter the institution. So whether it's government or healthcare or religion. But I think there's always this quest for power and money. And whether you're building something up or taking something down, So whether you're destroying the church or building up an organization that destroys the church, which is what is happening, you're still interested in that power and prestige to control. And I think for most people who are mystics, when I think back in the Christian faith, the mystics were the ones who rejected that, like Francis of Assisi. He was born into the Nouveau Riche, family, and totally rejected the consumerism of his day and went to live with the poor. It's that rejection of power, I think. And but you have forces that are creating power on both sides. And anyone who is, I think, spiritual or mystical doesn't want that and avoids that. What do you think?
I think you're right on. And I think that you eloquently answered that a way that, I mean, it's just so logical. And I just hope that it helps a lot of people understand that it's not that they're trying to get rid of religion because they feel, well, I can see it two ways. There might be a part of them which feels that religion has a dangerous hold in society and that it sways people the wrong way. I can see that, but then you're right. It is about, well, if we take the power away from the religion and the churches, then we will have more money for science, more money for, like you said, politics, the government. So you're right. It's like a transferring of basically of material power and wealth. And you're right. I mean, I can see it both ways. I can see that a lot of them genuinely are scared about the control that religion has over people's lives. And a lot of times we'll get very sad stories about how people were abused through the church or through pastors or through a religious upbringing. And so that is kind of put into the masses that, religion is dangerous. But then there's this other side of religion where, you show that it doesn't have to be dangerous. It can be taken with more of a lighthearted nature, more of a spiritual nature, in which that it's not dangerous. It becomes more of a way of life for people. But you're right. They kind of don't want to see that because it really doesn't do anything for the transference of power, like you said. So I think that was a very logical answer. And I hope it helps people understand what is going on between science and religion, is that it is a spiritual battle, but it's also kind of a materialistic battle too, because they both, like you said, on both sides, they want their wealth. They want their riches and their gain.
But there's a movement now within the scientific community and also the medical profession to bring spirituality back in, which I am very happy to see, because when I did my undergrad and we had to do a biology course for dummies, we weren't allowed to even discuss creation from a religious perspective. It was only evolution that we were allowed to, from a atheistic perspective, that we were allowed to talk about. And now I'm very close to a large Canadian university, and now there's at least dialogue between science and faith. I won't say religion, but between science and faith, which I think is what we need to do.
I completely agree. What branch of science would you say that is? Is it metaphysics?
Yeah, I was going to say physics. And the danger with some branches of science, especially physics, is, well, and others too, they become a law unto themselves as well. And within the community, you can't disagree either. So they almost become like a religious institution, that they have their dogma and doctrine. and the challengers are put down. So it took how many decades and I'm not a scientist, but for quantum physics, quantum mechanics to be accepted in the scientific community. I don't know how long, but to me, 50 years pops into my head. Now it's accepted, I would say probably in most sections of science, but it took forever for that to happen, because once you rock the boat, the status quo gets, pushed around, and nobody likes to be toppled or lose their position of power. It doesn't matter what institution you're talking about.
Yeah, and Carl Sagan was one of, I mean, people like to say he was an atheist, but he wasn't exclusively an atheist. He had some type of spirituality. And although I spoke with another atheist in an interview, is that you can be an atheist with a sense of spirituality. And Carl Sagan said that science and spirituality are not mutually exclusive. Like they actually do go together. And I believe that he was one of those that kind of pioneered that idea of bridging the gap. Because I am interested in these White Council meetings, if I can, in the future, bring science and religion together more, because that's something that I'm very, very interested in, because I do believe that that is the huge divide that we have. And it is a very intense war that people don't really realize, because a lot of it happens subconsciously and kind of under the surface. But religion and science have been fighting for a long time, and it's not a silent battle. It's one that the masses are part of, and it affects their life. It divides people. It brings people, I think, into kind of two pathways where they can't really see each other's points of view. And so my whole goal is really, I really do hope that I can get somebody who, has a lot of knowledge about quantum physics and metaphysics, and try to kind of bridge the gap and the kind of the misunderstanding. Because I think that if we do that, if we bring religion and science, or at least spirituality, together, we will have a very different world. We will have a world in which it will be one of where all civilians will be at a higher state of consciousness. And there will be a very deep, profound type of respect for one another. And I believe that life will just be much more grander and a lot more enjoyable for a lot of people, for everyone.
I think part of the problem is that people have fallen into literalism. So Christians who take the Bible literally are arguing with, who believe it's literally true, are arguing with scientists who say that the Bible is literally not true. There's no truth in it. So you have literalists at either end of the pole fighting with each other. And so you get evangelical Christians who literally believe the creation stories in Genesis to be true, being the voice for all of Christianity. And that's only one segment of or type of Christian in this world. But they're the ones that are the most vocal, and they're the ones that pick the fights with the scientists on social media. And that's part of the problem, is the two different groups that are fighting. But they're not the only ones. I just say, well, okay, you go over there, and if you're a literalist, have your fights over there. But there are other Christians that are spiritual. And I love science. I think science is great. I'm a person of faith, and I wish I had more of a scientific background to have a really good conversation with somebody about physics, because I like the whole idea of particles, and that's, to me, is so fascinating. and energy and all that kind of stuff. I'm not a literalist. So I put them over there and say, go ahead and fight. And let's get on with some really good conversation about the cosmos and the energy that created us and all that kind of stuff.
We are on the same wavelength. I don't know if you saw my video, but it was called, I believe it was The Problem with Religion, is that there's literalists, and I actually named it that, and then the figurativists, which would be able to see the Bible and the religious texts as more metaphors and more kind of figurative speech that really just kind of lead you to personal enlightenment. Whereas you have the literalists that are trying to take everything very word by word. And what happens with that is, to me, energetically, I actually see it as like a wall. It's like a stone wall. And so sometimes the immaterial spiritual wisdom from the religious texts do not penetrate through that stone wall. It's like they cannot allow it to come through. So the real message behind the Holy Spirit, the real message behind Jesus, you know, a lot of kind of his metaphorical speeches cannot penetrate through a literal stone wall. It really can't. And so you are right on the money that it is one of the things that we must transform. And so if we have more pastors and priests and reverends like you that can teach the people to see things more from an immaterial spiritual viewpoint, and quantum physics, metaphysics can actually come through and help in that way, because you can then learn, well, what's the universe made out of? It's not material. It's subatomic particles that really are just kind of vibrating in empty space. And so it's really, I think that is key, is to teach people to see things more from a spiritual standpoint, because we are spiritual beings. We are not really, I mean, we are material, but it's so temporary. And this is really a temporary material world. So when you read the books, and if you take it only literally, you are trapped within a very material construct of this world. And you yourself cannot experience and express yourself as a spiritual being on this earth. That's how I definitely see it.
And I'm not threatened by science.
Good.
And scientific theory, because I love it. I find it so fascinating that there are people that can actually think in those terms. And that's not my gift. But I appreciate everyone's gifts, you know, and we need all kinds of people in this world. So we end up being threatened by something that's different than us, you know, whether it's another culture, another person, another way of looking at the world. You know, I try not to be threatened by anything. Instead, embrace it, because there's truth in everything.
That's wonderful to hear. Do you like the show Through the Wormhole?
I'm not a TV watcher.
Oh, okay. Well, if you get a chance, you should definitely check it out. And it's
I'll try and watch it online.
Yeah, it's one of those shows that it's science with, you know, a kind of a metaphysical type of base to it. It's really nice, because it kind of goes back into kind of the history and the Enlightenment era, and a lot of the early scientists were very spiritual. They would look up to the sky, and they would just ask the question of, you know, about existence in general. And so that is actually what inspired them to start their scientific discoveries. So I think that you would really like that show a lot. And Morgan Freeman is one of the narrators.
I will do that for sure.
Yeah, definitely check it out. Okay, let's go on to more questions. This is exciting stuff. Okay. Number 4. So Uranian also told me that you have found some interesting correlations between ideas of consciousness and the Holy Spirit in the Aramaic text. Can you go deeper into your discoveries and show kind of the connection there?
So about 6 years or so ago, I came across a writer by the name of Neil Douglas Klotz, who I don't know if you've heard of him or not, but he was raised in a Lutheran Jewish family and converted to Sufism, but has spent 20 years studying Jesus from the Aramaic text. So he's got quite the background. And so I discovered him. His big project has been the Lord's Prayer from the Aramaic, which is much more rich and informative than, English translations of the scriptures of the Bible are so limited. I find myself more and more looking up when I have to preach on something or study. I'm looking up the Hebrew, I'm looking up the Greek, and when it comes to anything that Neil Douglas Klotz has studied, the Aramaic, which so he comes from a very different perspective, and so God is this energy, basically, and that permeates all things. And let me just see what else I have down here. Okay, so Aramaic was, for people who aren't familiar, the language spoken by people in first century Palestine. So that would have been the first language of Jesus. We don't know if he spoke other languages. Some people think he did. Others think that, he could have known some Hebrew to read the scrolls. But it's very, very interesting when you study in Aramaic. It totally opens up what Jesus was talking about and that cosmic connection that Jesus had. So, when we think about Jesus as a wisdom teacher or a wisdom master, it puts a very different slant on what he was saying, and then what the church turned him into, after about the 3rd century, 4th century, what Jesus became instead of what he actually was.
And that's really interesting that you said that it's about an energy. So in the Aramaic text, and I see this in the Bible too, that even though many people seem to think that God is masculine, there's this kind of masculine energy always in the mind of people, like, oh, he's a sky daddy sitting on a cloud judging mankind. But in the Bible, it's not that clear. I mean, there is he, but it's capital. So it's kind of more kind of kingly-like. But would you say that in the Aramaic text, when it's about this energy, is it more of kind of less of a deity and more of a pure force?
That I'm not quite sure of, because I'm not an expert in the Aramaic. But for Jesus, the creator was was father, mother, but more in the sense of birthing. So a lot of feminine images there because of the birthing nature of God. So when you create, you birth something new. So that's where the feminine comes into it, is this sense of God cannot be just masculine, because creation tends to be a feminine thing. And so Jesus was very much aware of God as not just father, but father, mother. And that goes back to that passage in Genesis chapter 1, where the Hebrew word for God in that passage is Elohim, which translates, according to Neil Douglas Klotz, as sacred unity.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's not, yeah, so it's not just one thing, but it's a sacred unity of um, all the forces, but all the forces within ourselves as well. And the feminine is very important.
So Tolkien, in his creation myth that he created in the Silmarillion, explained that, so there was Eru Ilúvatar, there was just one, this brilliant creator, and there was nothing, it was like a void. And then Eru Ilúvatar started to think, and so different, they're called the Ainurs, they came forward from his thoughts. And after a while, when the Ainurs started to kind of sing and play music, because Tolkien had this very interesting understanding about how music and vibration kind of creates the reality. And what is very interesting is that he kind of intuitively understood about this creation force, Eru Ilúvatar. So you have to go to the very first layer. So there was nothing except for this one. And then the Ainur split up. And then they started to take on different types of energy that would be masculine or feminine energies. So it shows that the masculine and the feminine energies came from this one source. So that's the sacred unity right there that you're talking about. And later on, what ends up happening is the Ainurs then become more physical. And so at first, it's just kind of energy of masculine and feminine. And they take on different essence to them. But then they start taking more physical shape. And then they start looking more like a female or like a male. And even though in today's time that is changing, which is very interesting on its own, because it is about kind of transformation, of kind of shifting people's perspectives of what masculine and what feminine is, that it's not really about outside appearances. It's about kind of the energy that you carry within you. And like you said, and I talk about this within my videos, I see nature as having really good examples of feminine and masculine, where you have the soil kind of moist and wet and kind of taking in the rain. The rain has been featured as masculine, as kind of a male god in a lot of different cultures in the past. So that idea of the masculine energy fertilizing and going into the warm soil that then embraces the water, and then a seed, sprouts. So I think that's really beautiful. Now, why is that missing from the Bible? Because I think that would really kind of help people see that, because that, of course, in the church, and you being a female reverend, you probably have seen this, but there has been patriarchy all the time, and so if that was shown in the Bible, I think it would show a very different aspect of the Creator and us as aspects of that creation in the material.
I think part of the problem is we rely too heavily on English translations of the Bible. And we idolize those English translations. So whichever one you take, more conservative Christians like the King James Version, for example. But some will claim is without error, the King James Version. Well, it's fraught with errors. Translation errors, as are most Bibles. So you can't just rely on an English translation of the Bible and think that you're going to get that rich depth of spirituality from a lot of the passages in there, because our language just, it's lost in translation, so to speak.
It's very interesting that you were talking about the King James, because I actually bought one on eBay, a Masonic temple King James Bible. And what I have learned is that the Masonic temples and the Brotherhood of the Illuminati and those that are in the different, the Freemasons have many different branches. But one of the things is that their Bible that they use within their temples is the King James Version. So it's interesting that you said that.
Well, in translations, all translations are politically driven. And changes are made to prop up a certain position. So one good example of that is the last chapter of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans. So Romans chapter 16. And in the oldest scripts, Paul recognizes a fellow apostle by the name of Junia, which is a woman. But later translations change that to a male name.
Oh,
Junia.
goodness. Wow.
Because, of course, you can't have an apostle that's female. And Paul gets a bad rap. I mean, he was a product of his culture, but he gave women a lot of leadership and worked side by side with women in the first century, you know, for the spreading of the story of Jesus and the gospel. But that was all taken away as soon as, you know, in the 4th century.
Yeah, King James, he commissioned to write this Bible. And so if he's a king and he comes from the mindset that, you know, males are above women in society, then that makes a lot of sense that he would commission his writers to take out all the important parts of women and to be in power or to be in any kind of way in a position close to Jesus. So that's really interesting. That I just want people to know that, and, you know, just be aware, because I know that there's a lot of women that kind of join with the Illuminati, or they support the Freemasons, and they kind of support that, and they are going by the King James, and they are going by that type of kind of rewritten Bible that I believe doesn't have the whole truth. And so that's why these types of male-dominated organizations exist, because they're almost using that Bible as a way to justify that really dominant type of masculine energy within creation. And it's not true. It's a sacred unity. And if I can say, I just want to say something, because I walked the path of a Sufi, and I really, Rumi is one of my spiritual teachers that really truly like helped me kind of awaken and into my more mystical nature and helped me remember who I really was. And one of the things that Rumi said that was really beautiful was that, and you know, when you read the Quran, which a lot of people are afraid to do, there are some verses in there that are of a kind of a mystical nature in the way that it kind of explains masculine and feminine. Now, you can be kind of distracted because there's a lot of things about kind of society at that time, 600 AD, like how women and men were very different and they had different social roles and things like that. But there is a very interesting verse within the Quran that Rumi really kind of talks about in a lot of his poetry, is that instead of Adam having his rib removed and then created Eve, where the Bible kind of explains that, is that then the Quran kind of changes it and says that it's more kind of a poetic way of describing it, is that from one cell kind of divided, one soul, that Adam or the first creation basically was one soul, and then it split into two. So it has that kind of sacred unity as well, and that's something that Rumi a lot of times teaches. So it's right in alignment to the true Aramaic text versus what we see in the King James Version. So I'm really happy that you said that. I'm glad that we went here, because I think that a lot of people need to know that. I don't suggest throwing out the King James Bible necessarily, but to take it with grain of salt, that, you know, to understand that King James translated that Bible. He had a commission of writers to rewrite the Bible to fit his perspective on what it should mean. And I just think I'm happy that we talked about this.
Well, and every translating committee is limited to where they are in time and what resources they have. And that was a great project in its day. But we also have to remember, as you mentioned, the scriptures were written for a particular culture in a particular time. And we can't stay stuck in those cultures. And a lot of religions do stay stuck in, the 17th century or wherever. I don't buy that, because then you have to abide by every law that's in the Bible. And none of us do. Jesus said, sell all you have and give it to the poor. Well, I would challenge any of those people who are telling women that they have to be silent, obey their husbands, etc., to sell all they have and give it to the poor. We won't do that. Yet we'll prop up these patriarchal cultures even today and say, oh, this is the word of God, instead of realizing it's a story about people in that context. And hopefully we've progressed and we've changed and we all embrace democracy, Yeah,
I know a lot of progressive Muslims and Christians and people that can see that those texts were written at a certain time, but we are not supposed to live like that. That God would want us to evolve and would want to see a change in society. That, to me, it's creation in general. So what does creation do? Creates new stars, new planets. So not only are we created on earth and we live our life, but creation is all over the place. We create ourselves, we create our lives, and we also are supposed to kind of synthesize and recreate our ages and evolve, because that's what's going to move life forward. It's not going to move life forward and create something new or expand on what has already been created by staying in that same old age. It does no good to humanity to kind of hold on to those old ages. We are supposed to, as spiritual beings, we are supposed to evolve and to move down a path into the future. That's really what the future means. It just means evolution. And for those that just hold on to the past, they're doing a disservice to all of humanity, in a sense where we are supposed to always move forward. That's how life expands and recreates itself. And I agree with you so much on that. And I'm very happy to see that there are a lot of people that are really trying to kind of push a more progressive mindset and say, well, those laws existed back then, but we're not supposed to do exactly that. We're supposed to synthesize the information given to us and transform it into something new that would make sense in today's world in 2018.
And also our image of God has to evolve as well, which it does all through the Bible. Their image, you see many, many different images of God throughout the scriptures. And I go with what Jesus said: love God with all your body, soul, spirit, mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. If you can do that, then you're doing it.
I particularly like John's verse where God is love. And because when you think about love, it's not a man, it's not a woman, it's not a physical body with arms and legs. It's a force. It's a force that unites all things together. that brings everything together. It is the force that creates the stars. It is the force that creates all life on planets to thrive and to grow. To me, creation is love, because the actual action of love is to give, and what is the ultimate giving is life, because that is the experience that we have. So that's how I see it. And I do agree with you. When you go through the Bible, and this is why it's so important for people to kind of see a multi-dimensionality of God, where it's, yes, it can be described as kind of a masculine energy, but then it can be described as something more feminine, more like a force. And then it can be described as kind of an ideal, or an idea that it kind of is in the realm of abstract thought. I mean, just the idea of omnipotent and omniscient and all of that. I mean, when people really get down to what those words actually mean, to be all-knowing, to be everywhere, I mean, these are very powerful abstract ideas. And it is not limited to a physical deity. It's not limited to something with arms and legs. And, it is in the realm of pure consciousness. It really is, where not only just pure consciousness, but it's self-aware, and to be able to create a storyline and know everything in all existence. And it's inside us. We are, I believe, we're fractals. It's basically like it's like a mirror, and then we're fractals of it. And we are representatives of this energy, and we express ourselves in so many different ways because this energy is infinite. So there's infinite type of souls to reflect back the image of God, of the German universal word that everybody uses. But it has many names. 72 names is something known in both in Islam and in Judaism. 72 names for one energy and force. And of course, it's all the most beautiful names, the most merciful, the most loving, it's all these. And I just think that when you get down to it, and like you said, we absolutely do have to evolve the way that we see it. That's why I really resonate with the Palladian message that Billy Meyer was given. And I included it on my channel because that is a way to see this energy as no longer kind of kept in a box that really divides people. Because if you have in the box a masculine God that's very personalized and more kind of like a Zeus character, well, then anything outside of that box, whether it's a feminine energy, whether it is a mystical energy of love, is not going to fit into their idea of what God is. And they're going to think that you're wrong because you're not in their box.
Exactly.
So we absolutely do need to evolve. Okay, I have some more questions. Boy, we are getting deep tonight. This is great. Okay. Number 5, you must be well aware of a lot of disregard and hate for religion in general. I get a lot of criticism from my atheist watchers when I even talk about Tolkien's view of spirituality. I myself don't believe you must have organized religion to be a spiritual person. But I do understand how some churches and temples are important for people, and I would never strip them of their rights. What would you like to say to those who are so filled of anger towards religion and those who are religious, if you could?
I also get very angry at religion. I especially, you think of the residential school system here in Canada that was run by churches and took, children from their parents, Indigenous children from their parents to, and I'm quoting this, get the Indian out of them. That's what the government said at the time. That makes me extremely angry because the last residential school was closed down in Canada in only 1993. And so I get very angry thinking that an atrocity like that could continue and only be closed down to 25 years ago. That makes me very angry that something like that would be propped up by Christian denominations. I also get very angry when I hear about all the sexual abuse that goes on in the church. Makes me furious, to the point sometimes I just want to toss it, to the curb. How can anyone be associated, with that? That's very much allowed. But there are other Christians who use their organization, their institution, to promote good things in the world, because we can do more together than we can do, individually. So in Canada, we've supported, the rights of women, especially the reproductive rights. I may not agree with abortion, for example, but I would never deny that right to a woman at all. And so our church doesn't think that abortion is the best possible option for someone. But if someone chooses that as their option, then we as clergy will journey with them and help to support them. So a few years ago, we wrestled for actually a long time about homosexuality. And recently we allowed for clergy to perform same-sex marriages and also to ordain people. Now, I don't know how broad that has gone, because recently gender identification is expanding more and more and more. But we do welcome people of whatever gender expression they may have. So we also, because we're a group, we can challenge the government on a lot of their policies or responses to different issues in Canada. So we try to do that to move our society along and not to go backwards when it comes to especially human rights. So I think it's natural for people to gather together, whatever they're interested in. So I think it's important not to be a loner in whatever it is. So whatever your faith beliefs are or your faith practices are, I think we naturally, birds of a feather kind of thing. We try to find like people in the same community, because there's nothing that I enjoy more than having a good spiritual conversation with someone, like our conversation that we're having tonight. I'm sorry, but I can't get into talking about sports.
Me either.
I just can't do that. And I don't understand the intensity of those conversations. But to talk about where you are and what God means to you, or what your faith means to you, or whatever it is that you believe in means to you, I love that kind of conversation, because it means that somebody's being self-reflective and going very deep into themselves about what they believe. So yes, I don't blame people for being very angry at the church. I'm very angry at the church as well in certain regards. But the church can also do very good things, which we do here at in my congregation, as do many, many, many churches try to make a difference in society.
So on that same idea, have you had members who may have been atheists before, and then they come to you, and I mean, have you seen any kind of changes?
I have, yes, I don't expect every person who associates with this congregation to be in the pew on Sunday morning, because to me, our relationship isn't just that. And for some people, they just can't walk through the door and into a Sunday morning service, but they can come here for a gardening class. And we talk about spiritual things as we're weeding or as we're harvesting or planting. So I've had many conversations with people, and I have several volunteers with our programs who are atheists, many of them.
That is an example of unity to me. So that's really great.
Yeah, because I don't judge them, they don't judge me, but we talk about what's important to us. And it doesn't matter where we talk. That's what I like, is that a lot of different people feel welcome here, and people of different religions as well, and people who have no religion. It's let's just talk about life.
Would you say that your church is more kind of universalist, where you accept a lot of different faiths in?
No, I wouldn't go that far, because I do have friends who are universalist, and their congregations are very different than ours. I still stick with a Lutheran flavor in our worship services. So I would say that no, that's not where we're at this point. Or if we'd evolve into that, I don't know.
No, I think that it's good that you have a certain focus. I mean, because we all have to come from different perspectives, and we'll leave that for the universalists to take care of. But I feel that, energetically, your kind of church, with the way that it is being presented, at least, is a place where those of different faith might, even though they have a different faith, they might just like come in and maybe listen or take a class, or, if they live in the neighborhood and they're just kind of interested. It just seems like a very welcoming place. So even though it might not be considered universalism, it seems to be more like accepting of others, which is, I think it's really great. And I think a lot of Christian churches could probably, model after, because that is really what Jesus was trying to teach about loving thy neighbor, right?
Well, and I've always asked the question, if someone joins this congregation, do they have to become a Lutheran? And my answer is no. I don't think you need to become a Lutheran per se to be a member of this congregation. What you need is, to be a member is a desire for a more intimate experience or knowledge of the divine. That's the number one criteria. And then if it suits you, what we do, that's great. And if it doesn't, then, continue on your journey, kind of thing.
I love that. All right, let's continue on.
Yes.
So, in your opinion, what does religion have to do in the future, and what do devotees to the religion have to become like, or them to coexist with others of non-faith or other faiths?
Well, I think we have to see each other as connected. I know that the issues that humans face are very complex, and a lot of it has to do with land, who's allowed to be where. So it's not an easy thing to do, but I think if we realize that we are connected and we're all human beings, where you still get people in different pockets of the world who see another race or a cultural group as not even being human. That still happens today, and that their life is not worth anything. That causes, a lot of problems. what causes a lot of problems is when Christians fight among themselves. I think of the First World War. We're at the 100th anniversary of the end of the war. And all those European leaders were all related to each other. And they're all supposed to be Christians. And they're all family, too, the descendants of Queen Victoria. So we have to be very careful. I think any group, how we present ourselves, in public, because we do very much influence people. And I'm thinking about the shooting at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, 2 weeks ago. And what we say very much people take to heart. So if we have a message that is intolerant, that's what people are going to pick up on. And if people in power say those things and people think that they can do those things. So I think our messages, regardless of who we are, have to be one of acceptance and peace, in order to have somewhat of peace in the world and in our communities.
And I would say that maybe perhaps a little bit more of a deeper understanding about science, because when you talk about understanding that we are all connected, when you go deeper into science, that can help people kind of see that, because when you study quantum physics, when you study, the invisible world around us, you can start to see everything as like on an energy field and sharing each other's molecules, basically. I mean, we're constantly passing forth different energies. And I mean, when you look at the world in kind of an immaterial way of looking at the science that is beyond what we can see right now, you can get an understanding of how we really are connected physically. I mean, we share the same energetic space in the universe. And I think that can really help people see the unity as well.
I really like that idea. Because when we think about, well, what can connect us, you can say, well, love can connect us, but that's, a little not solid enough for some people. So if I like that idea of science, because especially the science that that they're doing now in physics, it really shows a connection between not just us, but the whole cosmos. And not just our universe, but all, everything that's out there. So that's an interesting idea of science being a connector between us.
Tolkien really kind of explained that too within the creation myth, is that everything kind of stems from one consciousness, and then all thought forms come from that. And so when you can kind of see yourself coming from, you're all different, you're all unique souls here, and then you've all come from one source, I think it can help people see each other more in a clearer light, where they might be able to question their emotional responses towards one another, or at least not see so much, division and hatred in the world, because we can then understand one of the big lessons that's going on in this world, which is really beautiful to see, that a lot of people are evolving into very empathic beings. I think that's kind of the next stage, where people talk about, oh, I'm an empath. Well, yes, because we all have that ability to be empathic, which actually means that you put yourself, your mind, your thoughts, your essence, your everything into the actual mind of another, and you feel what they're feeling. And that is proof that we all come from kind of the same one consciousness source. But then we also have an ability to kind of divert ourselves. It's like we become subjective in our perspectives, and we have our own individual stories going on. But there's one steady stream of consciousness that we can all tap into. And that is when we can feel that connection to one another. But it's not always on, but we have to get to the point where, and my goal, And I think a lot of people's goals who are very spiritual, one of their goals is to always be there. So even though you might have your individual life, you're always reminded of being part of that pure consciousness. And I guess to religious people, that would mean that you would always be living with the Holy Spirit, which to me, the Holy Spirit just means the higher consciousness, the higher self that you incorporate into your kind of ego self. And you are kind of always reminding yourself that everything comes from one source.
And one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is we really promote independence, but we're really, that's a fallacy. We're interdependent because not one of us can stand alone by ourselves. We need others around us. And we're unique, but we're not unique. We think that our planet in the solar system is unique, but if you look at every other planet and the sun, look how unique they are. They're different, but they're so special in their own way. And so I think we have to kind of get off the top of the heap as humans, thinking that we're the only intelligent ones. Where when you look at plants or trees and how they operate and the intelligence that they have, or even your pet, we were talking about our dogs earlier. You know, if I had the sense, the ability to smell the way my dog does, you know, it doesn't mean I'm any more unique than she is. You know, she's so amazing in you know, what she was created to be. So I think the focus needs to be on interdependence. We all need each other, and we're unique, but we're not. You know, everything is unique.
That's very true. One of the things that I think is happening in our world, and it's really exciting for me to experience, is this idea of kind of coming together. A lot of people are very empathic and are really connecting to one another and having very heart-to-heart connections. Their energy really connects to one another, and they vibe with each other. But then there is this other opposite perspective happening where everybody is kind of showing their very unique sides. And that's why I'm very much a promoter of starseeds and otherkins, because I do feel that that is going to help bring in more uniqueness to this world. And it's almost like the creator that we come from is expanding. And, you know, physicists actually say that the universe is expanding. I mean, there's physical proof that the universe is expanding. So as the universe is expanding, well, then to me, it, you know, as above, so below, it seems like then the humans on Earth are going to show that same type of expansion within themselves, within the community, within society, within everything. And we are going to have in the future a very interesting world where we're going to have a lot of very unique souls. And it is going to show a lot of different origins from other planets. I absolutely, I feel that in my heart, that the God of this universe that we're all so connected to is not one that is exclusive to this planet. I really do.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting, because, of course, the age-old question, where did we come from? And where does consciousness come from? And all those things that science yet has not, where does life come from, been able to answer or reproduce, you know. So it'll be interesting to see where we are at 100 years from now. Or
I'm on a quest to find more and to discover more. I mean, my whole theme in my life is wisdom, and I try to gain more and more knowledge. And what I have kind of recently realized, only very recently, is that you can be at the highest level of consciousness on a planet as a very love and light being. But if you are in the material world, you will never have all the answers. Only when you are in the immaterial realms of spiritual, being and essence, that's when you get the answers that you seek. So even though it's fun to look for the answers, you really get the answers in depth. To me, that's how I'm really starting to see it. But it doesn't stop me from looking, and because it's about the joy of learning. But I do feel that you can get to a point where you have such a high consciousness. Take it from Tolkien with his quote that even the wisest beings cannot see all ends. So, that is so powerful in the idea that you can have the most ancient, wise being, and yet if they are still in their kind of fractal identity and they're still in the material world, they're not going to have all the answers. There's some type of mystery, there's some secret that we always have to kind of allow ourselves to have. And maybe each lifetime we discover more and more. That's kind of how I've been seeing things lately. And it really helps me because I do think that you can become kind of obsessed. And I know that those in the occult are very much in this realm of obsession to know. And that is their whole thing. Like the Gnostics are all about knowledge, and that's what Lucifer represented is giving knowledge to Adam and Eve. And it becomes this quest to always know and have more knowledge. And that's when they get into black magic and the occultism, and they get really deep down those kind of, paths, because all they really are searching for is the answers to existence. And I think that it can be a dangerous game because you can drive yourself crazy. You really can. You can become very obsessed with it. So there has to be a point where you can kind of let that go and understand that you're not going to know everything. Even the wisest beings will not know everything. But eventually, I think there's a point when you're not in the material anymore. When you with what you would call God is when you remember and you're back home, and you're part of something. You're part of a grand collective of love, of light, of energy. And I think a lot of spiritual people are searching for a way to go back home.
I find that in those awe moments when I may not even be outside in nature, but the other week I looked out of my office window and I saw this cloud formation that, wow. So I ran outside, but there was so much wind. By the time I got outside, it had blown away. But I saw it from my office window. And to me, those are the moments those awe moments, when I connect the deepest with myself and the divine within me and all of creation, is when you can have those moments of connection during the day. Then you know that there's something bigger and outside of yourself that's inside of yourself as well. So I try to always see if I can just, even out of the corner of my eye, see something. Whether it's I know this sounds simple, but whether it's a bee or a flower or anything, I try to connect with those kind of things. But just those awe moments out in nature of what humans can't create, what this life force has given us, that's when I find my deepest spirituality is in those moments. And that's why Jesus was never found. He was always outside. You know, he wasn't in the temple, or, I mean, he went to the temple, he went to the synagogue, but he was outside a lot, walking and experiencing all of that. Of course, they had no other really means of transportation. But he, you know, appreciated earth and what God has given us, as well as, you know, people.
I agree. I think when I'm in nature is when I get the closest to the divine. And it reminds me of my higher self. And I feel that that is why I have kind of evolved into more of this elven soul, is because I am reconnecting to my divine self. And with my perspective, that is symbolized in nature. And so becoming one with nature has really helped me in my own spiritual awakening. I cannot stress that enough. There are so many mystics, there are so many really enlightened people within our past and present that have suggested that when you are quiet and you go into nature and you just take time away from everything, seeing nature in its most simple form is the closest to the divine for a lot of people, and it really gets them kind of reconnected, because this is not divine. I mean, this is
Exactly.
fun, this is a tool, but it doesn't necessarily get me towards my higher self. What does on this phone is connecting and emailing and meeting people like you. And so we're, you know, it is about connecting souls to soul, and it's also connecting to nature. And I think that those two priorities is what can really bring people onto a very solid spiritual path, in which you aren't really tempted into some of kind of the material pleasures that actually bring your life into a personal hell, because you're trying to escape. And I find that you can transcend this material world by investing yourself in relationships with people and connecting soul to soul, and investing your time in reconnecting to nature. I think that those two things can always remind people. And Jesus, on his last day, he prayed in the gardens of Gethsemane. So I think that was such an important part to write in the Bible, because it shows that Jesus went into kind of like a reflective mode, and he surrounded himself with nature and was away from everyone. And I think that's something that a lot of the master teachers teach. Rumi, I love the story of Rumi. To me, he's like kind of a Tom Bombadil character if you ever read Tolkien stories. Rumi is very interesting, and he has kind of this fairy soul to me. When I read about him, he was very jolly. And one of the things that the Persian and well, because he actually was born in Afghanistan. So one of the things that the Afghanistan Islam scholars did not like about him was that he would always be twirling around and dancing and singing in nature. Like, he would actually go into these areas with flowers and fields and be like swirling around and just la la la, like dancing and singing. And they would ask him, the scholars, because he was a Quran scholar, and the other Quran scholars that would go to the same university would say, "What are you doing? This is haram. This is sinful. You know, you're not supposed to be involved with music, and music is from the devil." I mean, there are Muslims who still think that. And Rumi said, "I get closer to the divine when I am moving with the celestial bodies of the universe, of the planets, moving around and being one with nature and singing." I mean, he basically made his whole life an expression of joy of creation. So not only was he devoting himself, as some people do, when they get very strict and they see it as like, well, I have to devote myself to this God, they forget to have fun. They forget to be creative and playful. And so Rumi has this very playful personality. And it's just fascinating how the whole Sufism came from, because that whole twirling, the whirling dervishes, it came from Rumi just twirling around in the garden singing.
That's a great story.
Yeah, he's phenomenal. I mean, to me, he's very much like a kind of a fairy soul. I see that, like a peri. In Arabian language, the fairies are known as the peri. So I definitely can see that. Okay, I have one last one.
Okay.
Actually, two more. If you can explain best, how do you define or see God in your own mind and heart? How is it different or not different from other spiritual paths? I know this is very hard, but I just thought that it would be kind of good to kind of encapsulate how you see God.
Well, my image of God evolved over my lifetime. When I was a small child, God was very kind and loving. By the time I got to be a teenager, maybe because of my rebellious nature, God was more of the judge, and I was always in trouble, and in trouble with God. So when I got, and I'm dating myself, but when I got into my 40s, and I think probably a lot of people, that midlife crisis age, I had to re-image God from what I had been taught by my parents, and especially by the church. So now God is, again, still continues to evolve in my mind as I grow spiritually. And now God is more the source of love and light and all energy. So it's especially the more I read and the more I study, the writings of different people, whether, modern or ancient. I find that God is always, that image is always changing, but it's always moving toward a different point, so away from the person, like the man in the clouds kind of thing, the Michelangelo kind of stuff, but toward, something that's an all-embracing kind of light and love. So God keeps changing, and I allow myself to image God differently as well. So when you talk about the different names of God, I meditate on, what does it mean that God is my rock? Or when Jesus said, God is like a mother hen who gathers her chicks to herself. So I think about the different images of God that other people have given us, and think about those as well. I think that's, and I think from other spiritual paths, everybody is, I think more or less teaches us that we're interconnected. It doesn't matter what, the teachers, if they teach otherwise. So if they teach, religious leaders teach hate or violence, then I don't think they're at all connected with God. We're all capable of being violent, but when you actually talk about your teachings, if they stray away from that path of love, then I don't think they're a authentic religious teacher.
And I see the poster on the back wall where you have the golden rule for all the faiths. So when you said that, you definitely are a person that can see the interconnection between all the different faiths. And I have read the Hindu texts, as many as I can because there's so many. But within the Vedic texts, within the Bible, within the Quran, within the the first part of the Bible, which is the Torah, basically, and within the Book of Dead, and all these different types of religious texts that we still have, these ancient texts, one of the things that keeps kind of coming up is that there really is no physical description of God. You don't have descriptors in there, well, it had blue eyes or brown hair. Like, there's no actual physical descriptions of a physical being. And so that's something that I think that all faiths kind of need to hold on to, is to understand that, they're seeing kind of the same great spirit in all the different religions. They're kind of just coming at it from different perspectives and points of view. But one of the things that they all have in common is there is no physical description. So God can look like anything. God can be anything.
And I think the spiritual practice of reflecting on the names of God is very mind expanding, and helps a person to expand in their spirituality, because we can only think in terms of what we see. It's very hard for us to conceive of something that we've never seen before. So for me, it's very helpful to get me away from one image of God. So God is masculine, for example. When I reflect on the different images of God, and from different religions even, that helps to expand my understanding and not be so rigid that this and only this is God. And I think all your great spiritual teachers, and Jesus taught us that too, that you can't put God in a box and say this is God, because God always blows everything up when you do that.
So with your perspective on God, is it different with your perspective of what Jesus was?
I think Jesus was a reflection of God. I think Jesus was incarnate, whatever that means. And that is a lifetime of reflecting on what that means. I'm not a literalist. So you look at the four Gospels, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Luke has, for example, the birth story of Jesus with the shepherds and the angels in the manger. Matthew has the wise men, so to speak, from the east coming. Jesus is in a house and probably 2 years old or something. The Gospel of Mark doesn't speak about a birth story. Neither does the Gospel of John, per se. And the Apostle Paul never taught, who's the first writer of what's in our New Testament that we call the New Testament, never speaks about a birth story. So there's a lot of things you have to hold up there and try to understand why Christians saw Jesus in a certain way and others did not. And then when you look at there were probably dozens upon dozens of gospels floating around in the first century, and 4 of them got into what we call our scriptures. But then if you look at the Gospel of Thomas or anything else, it's a very different understanding of Jesus.
Those Gospels, where can we find those that didn't enter into the Bible?
Well, probably not all of them. You can find the Nag Hammadi Codex, they call it, was probably hidden for about 1700 years and discovered around the same time as the Dead Sea Scrolls. around 1946, somewhere in there. So if you Google that, then you'll come up with all the different ones that survived and have been translated and that we now have access to. But it took until the early 1990s for scholars to even have access to, let's say, the Gospel of Thomas, for example, and then for us to get it in English. And now scholars are thinking that the Gospel of Thomas was probably one of the first ones written, which is just the different sayings of Jesus. And then eventually they were put into a narrative or story format. So if you Google the Nag Hammadi Codex, then you'll find out what is in there and what's not. And some are just in fragments. They're not in whole pieces, like a whole scroll or whatever. But that gives you a very different understanding of what the diversity in Christianity in the first century. We often think it was homogenous, just like we think Judaism was homogenous in the first century, but it wasn't. So there's many very different expressions of Christianity from the first century, and the four Gospels that we have reflect that. But there's many others with different understandings of Jesus.
Have you heard about Mary Magdalene? She, her gospel. I don't know if it's true or not, but I have seen some articles that have suggested that they have found her gospel. I don't know if you've heard about it or have seen it, or do you know any reliable sources to be able to read it? I would love to.
Elaine Pagels, she's a biblical scholar. She has done some very good translations. So it's something you'd have to Google, because different people have. It's taken a long time for scholars to get to see the original or copies of the original, photographs of them. And translation is as good as the translator. And of course, with Mary Magdalene, there's all these, if you read the Da Vinci Code and that kind of stuff, what kind of relationship did Jesus have with Mary? And the Gospel of Thomas presents a very intimate one. And I won't, sexually or not, who knows, but very intimate one that's challenged by the other disciples. They didn't, according to the Gospel of Thomas, didn't like, Mary's relationship with Jesus. And then when you get into her gospel, so you get a very different Jesus than you do from what we have in the Bible, a different take on Jesus, which is very interesting.
That is very interesting, because that would show him as more maybe human, but with this pure consciousness that, like you said, reflected the divine as a master teacher to others that are on earth. Have you heard about the term Christ consciousness?
Yes. Tell me more.
Well, the idea is that, and I would love to hear what you think about this, but I do believe that Christ consciousness and the idea of the Holy Spirit that the Catholics and Christians have talked about are really one and the same. Is that the idea that you don't do good yourself, but you bring in the Holy Spirit to do good acts for you. So the Christ consciousness is the idea of like kind of the highest pure consciousness that a human can be at, that would radiate divine love, forgiveness, complete empathy and compassion towards your fellow, neighbors, even when they do you wrong. You would actually act as Jesus on earth. And there are a lot of people reaching into this place. And so in the New Age, that is something that I feel is kind of in the baby steps. but it's definitely growing. It's a growing movement. I actually have my own Facebook group that I created a couple of years ago about Christ consciousness, because I always considered myself an indigo, which is somebody that was born into kind of the indigo consciousness, which is all about the third eye. So it's very, third eye, mysticism, being able to see beyond the physical world. And then the next level from the third eye is violet consciousness, because it's, it's like the rainbow spectrum of the chakras. And so the violet consciousness is when the crown opens and you have that full enlightenment going through. And to me, the Holy Spirit is basically the same or very similar to the idea of the Kundalini energy coming through your body when you go through all the chakra levels in your life and your crown opens up. And then that's supposed to represent violet consciousness. And violet consciousness is synonymous with the Christ consciousness. And when you're at Christ consciousness, you are basically a true disciple of Jesus. You never met him, you're in 2018, but you're able to embody the aspects of what Jesus taught. So I think that shift from worshiping him and not seeing yourself as able to embody the same type of consciousness or at least behaviors as him needs to shift in the church, because embodying violet consciousness and Christ consciousness will catapult our society into the world that Jesus was trying to create.
I think that's very true, because when you read, even in the Gospels that we have, the 4 Gospels, when you read the parables of Jesus, that's what he's trying to move us into, is out of how we are thinking into how he is thinking. So if you study Neil Douglas Klotz, for example, and his Aramaic take on the Lord's Prayer, it's so difficult for us to, like, for example, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. A lot of these sayings of Jesus, we just can't wrap our heads around. And that's what the Gospels tell us, is that the disciples were confused. They could not understand what he was saying. And what Jesus wants us to do is understand that, which takes us to a very different level. For example, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. To really live that out, like, how do you even do that?
You have to be almost like how the Buddha is. I mean, how the Dalai Lama is, where you are completely one with everything and living in that divine love. And I that it is harder. It is harder to do if you do not do the work to get there. And that's kind of what the chakras are all about, is aligning the chakras. I mean, the chakra system came from the Hindu texts, which is really interesting because it shows this kind of connection from the very beginning times. There was this message to humanity about reminding them to keep on working on yourself. If you want to get out of suffering and you want to, you want to experience actual true joy, you want to get to the truth. It's called the true reality of things. Then you have to go through the different chakra levels. And when you get to the different chakra levels and you go through them all and you get to the crown opening, that is when the Christ consciousness enters in. And to me, that should not be a threat to Christianity, where, that's like a bridge between Hinduism and Christianity, where they can see that the Krishna consciousness is the same as the Christ consciousness, because the Krishna consciousness is basically the same thing, is that Krishna was this all-loving master teacher. He was blue, but he came to earth and he showed so much to humans about how to obtain that high level of consciousness. And it is harder than, well, it's hard if you're not aware of yourself. And that's the whole thing about the awakening versus the asleep. It's like the awakened ones versus the asleep ones. So the asleep ones, they are kind of moving in an unconscious state where they let things happen to them, and they're, reacting emotionally without any higher thought behind it. And then when you're awakened, when you're actually in your awakened state, you are supposed to be able to act like Krishna or Jesus, where you're able to see the true reality behind that situation that just happened to you. So always you're able to kind of transcend the material world and not let it drag you back down and tempt you into those suffering type of cycles. I mean, there's a lot of interconnection between Krishna consciousness and the Christ consciousness. And my message and why I wanted to talk about this is because one of the things I wanted to talk about in the Elven White Council is to show that we can have this bridge between the New Age and the Old Age of Christianity, and in, of course, other religions as well, that the ones that hold on to kind of the traditional religions do not have to fear the New Age, because really the New Age, if you can discern between what's just leading people into kind of hedonism and is more distracting their spiritual path, but if Christians and in those who are religious can actually see that the New Age is really just an evolved understanding of what the master teachers were saying back then, like you said, where the disciples didn't understand Jesus. They were just not at that consciousness level. And so when they wrote it down, it didn't translate the same. It can be very meaningful to people when they read it. And if you have the eyes where you can kind of go beyond the literal words and you can actually read the energy behind it, the energy of love, the energy of giving, trying to give joy to the physical beings and trying to kind of take away their suffering, then that, I think, is where we can have that connection between the New Age and the Old Age, is to see that the New Age is kind of just an evolved perception of what the texts were trying to speak about before, and the master teachers like Jesus and even Krishna. Yeah. But it would be really interesting to see. I don't know if there's any churches that are doing this right now, but to be able to talk about, because the Christ consciousness is kind of it's a taboo to a lot of people, because some people see it as, well, you can never be like Jesus, that we are supposed to worship and devote ourselves to Jesus, but we can never be like Jesus. And when I read the Bible and when I have studied the character of Jesus, he never said, worship me. In fact, many verses said, oh, don't worship me. Learn from me. Just do as I do.
That's always been a question in Christianity. Who do you focus on most? God the Father, God the Son, or Jesus, or the Holy Spirit? And yeah, Jesus did say not to worship him. We worship the Creator, God, in spirit and in truth. So it's hard to dust away what the church has turned Jesus into, and see what he really was. That's a very difficult thing to do unless you do a lot of study, and because we're so ingrained with the teachings of the church, on that. So, what does it mean to say that Jesus was divine? That's there are thousands of books written on, so it's, I think it's a very personal thing on how it helps you to grow and become more like Jesus. To me, the danger is if you make it very rigid and put it in a box and say, everybody has to believe this way, because there's so many different Christians who believe differently. So for myself, yeah, I'm not a literalist. So the birth stories of Jesus, if you were an important person in the first century, your mother was a virgin and your father was a god. So that was, and there were, to say son of God was also an honorific expression. So Moses, David, Cyrus, who wasn't even Jewish, was a son of God as well. You were a person who was connected very closely with the divine, and you were righteous as well as another word.
People fail to see that. So that's very interesting that you said that it's not that title was exclusive to Jesus, but it was an adjective to describe a certain relationship that a person would have with the divine. And I think that's really important. I'm glad that here we are on YouTube in 2018 and you said that to help really kind of enlighten people.
Well, and if you study the history in Palestine in the first century, they were so oppressed by the ruling class, by the temple authorities, and by the Romans, that there was so much chaos then, and they were looking for a Messiah. People were looking for a new king. There were bandits all over the place. So Jesus being a Messiah was not unique either, because there are many people who either self-identified as a Messiah or their population group identified them as a Messiah. What made Jesus different was he didn't identify. We put all those labels on him. So when people wanted to make him king, he went, and ran away. I don't want to be a king, because kings get crucified in the first century, these little local people. And Richard Horsley's studies on what was happening in the first century is very informative on that, because it gives you a totally different perspective of Jesus and what he was fighting against, because people wanted to put him in a box, and he said, no, I don't go in these boxes that you have created, because he was, a wisdom teacher. He wasn't out to be a Messiah or out to be a king or whatever.
Even though the novel got a lot of negative, criticism, but The Temptation of Christ shows that, definitely shows that it shows Jesus as struggling with that type of kind of public fame, and really just being a carpenter that has this driven need inside of him he had the calling, and it shows this interesting evolution of Jesus, and how he just really shunned away from the public pronouncing him as king. He's like, no, it's the Father. It's not me. And but very much the Father was inside of him. I mean, it can get very complicated, but that novel was very good in showing that. And I know that it was banned, and he was like exiled from the church too, the actual writer. So talking about banned people,
yeah.
One last question. So Tolkien was, you either love him or you don't, and he had a lot of criticism, especially from the Christians and the church in general, with his tales of Middle Earth, and a lot of his stories about magic, and just all of the things that he represented in Lord of the Rings and in his other novels, of course, too. So you, obviously, I think that, you know, you had that connection to, at least you, I mean, do you enjoy Lord of the Rings? What's your perspective
Well,
on Tolkien?
well, the movies I have watched repeatedly.
That's
Es-
great.
es- especially the first one.
That's my favorite. The Fellowship, yeah.
Yes, because I like the idea of the hero, you know, and the hero's journey, you know, and that's in each one of us. And the whole idea of journeying both physically, you know, in this body, and also spiritually and in relationships and all that way. You know, those things were just incredible. They fight between good and evil, and that fight that's in us, you know, and how so easily it is to give into things that sparkle, you know, with and how we can lose our way, you know, with those kind of being attached to those things that because we know physical things don't satisfy us, and they can even take us down, you know. So I that was so especially in the first movie, you know, pretty incredible. I like the whole image of death and resurrection, you know, in there. The
With
image of a
with Gandalf the Grey, or what part of the resurrection? I would love to hear about this.
okay, so well, they're going through the where the elves used to, not the elves, the dwarfs used to live,
Oh,
and yeah, and Gandalf falls and dies, and they're mourning his death. And then, of course, he comes back, you know, all of a sudden this bright white light, you know, in that dark forest, you know, but what do you have to go through in order to get there, you know? And that whole idea of not that it's that biblical, but Jesus descending to the dead, and you know, that whole kind of thing. And I really like just the thing of community, the hero who ends up being the hero at the end, you know, and how they're each their own hero, those kind of things. And also these spiritual battles that they have, that's, you know, reflected in the actual physical battles. um, yeah, all those kind of things. And especially when he's carried across the river, you know, on the white horse, and all that.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
the sailing to the undying lands. I mean, who doesn't cry at the end? It's like a beautiful kind of release cry. I mean, because to me
Yeah.
that symbolizes Tolkien was very spiritual, and he was a genius in the idea that the undying land symbolizes
Yeah.
everybody's desire to eventually sail to. And just the idea that Frodo was invited, because at first, you know, it's just the elves because they symbolized being close to the divine, and then, but it showed this kind of evolution where it's not just for one species, it's not just for the elves, it's for everyone that is deserving of it, in the sense that they do the work to fight the demons, to fight the darkness, you know, to overcome the temptations of keeping the ring for himself. Or, you know, I mean, Frodo had to go through so much agony just holding on to this ring that kept on, you know, clawing at him and wanting him to put it on. And him being able to do that symbolizes the battle within all of us, like how you said. And then that sailing to the undying lands is like a release. I mean, every time I watch that, I just bawl and cry, because it's a beautiful it's a beautiful moment. And the book is even more beautiful because, well, I don't want to give it away because I really do want people to read the book and not just watch the movie, but there's a different type of ending. I mean, Frodo sails, of course, but there's more that goes to the Undying Lands. It's not just Frodo. And I think that, like you said, the idea of community, where their friendship is what, and that community together actually drives them to take each other's hand and walk each other home, as Ram Dass, one of the great mystics, said, that we're all just walking each other home. And that's really why we connect to one another. And, you know, it really is. I know that there's an independence kind of movement going on, which is beautiful to see. It's like, you know, and I'm part of that. I mean, express yourself and don't care about what others think. But at the same time, there's this delicate balance in which we have to remember we are in this world together. We are in this universe together. And we cannot experience the next level of experience without working together. I mean, that's really how the laws of physics have been set. But it's fun, you know, we find each other. I just want to leave off, there's a beautiful movie. It's one of my favorite sci-fi movies. And since you like science, you might like this movie. It's called Love. And it is all about an astronaut that is out, he's out in space, and he realizes that he's the last remaining one on Earth, that something happens. There's wars with each other, and the Earth, I mean, the human species basically just destroy themselves. So he is the last one, and he is all alone. And then what ends up happening is there's another type of intelligence that comes to meet him. And this intelligence is so far advanced. They have evolved to the point of understanding about the connection that is so vital for this universe to function in the way it does, that they show him the answer to everything is really connecting to each other to feel love. And it's the most beautiful movie. And I mean, it's a great sci-fi movie, and I think you would really enjoy it, Loretta. I think you should definitely look at it.
I love sci-fi too.
It's I gave you the plot, but it's still a lot. There's a lot behind it, and it's just beautiful. But Tolkien had that same theme, and I think that those who truly awaken will join hands with others. It's not going to be kind of a lone battle. Although it seems like it, we're all kind of on our independent journey and battle within ourselves, but we really do need each other. And that's why I call these meetings together. And I'm really happy to meet other souls like you. And this has been truly a great experience. So I'm very happy to have you on. And so far, these White Council meetings have been really successful.
Thank you for having me, and it's been a delight to meet you and to finally get a chance to talk and to connect. And yeah, I really appreciate what you're doing too, you know, to try and bring us all together. That's so important.
Well, namaste.
Namaste, yes.
And God bless. And I will leave the description about the church that you are working in, so that people can find you if they do live in Canada, and if they are just kind of moved by what you talk about. I do want them to feel that, you know, it's a community for them, and to embrace that. So I'll leave the information below in the description. I don't see any questions, but that might just be a problem with the chats, because sometimes that doesn't work. Loretta, is there a way to leave your email? I mean, are you open to having questions from people? I know you're very busy, but, you know, through time, I mean, is that something that you would be open to? Since I don't have the ability, I guess people are not able to ask questions. I don't know. So that has happened before.
Sure, you can leave my email address. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been an absolute joy, and I think a good conclusion to our white council meeting, and Hen and Lay for watching, everybody who has stayed with us. Oh my goodness, it's been
what time is it?
Time. 2.5 hours. We can really talk.
Has it really been?
I can really talk about spirituality as an introvert. I don't want to be out in the crowds, and I want to stay home and be in nature and be left alone. But when it comes to spirituality, I can talk all day. So, so thank you so much for hanging in there, everybody. And do you want to say any last words, Loretta?
No, I think it's time for bed. I can't believe it's been 2.5 hours.
I know. We got into some very deep discussions, which I think will have some very positive effects, I hope. I know there will be some people that it will kind of, push up against what they have been thinking and what they have been raised to, but I'm hoping that it has the power behind it to open up perspectives and expand perspectives. So we'll see. But peace, love, light, and unity to you all. And I will see you all on the next video. Namaste, Loretta.